The envelope had been sitting on Hazel Morrow's kitchen table for 11 days. She knew because she'd been counting. Not obsessively, or maybe obsessively, she wasn't sure anymore, but the way you count things when counting is the only thing left you can actually control. 11 days since the registered letter arrived from Sunridge General Hospital. 11 days since she'd read the words, "Termination of employment effective immediately," and then read them again, standing in her bathrobe at 6:15 in the morning, with a mug of tea going cold in her hand. She hadn't opened the second envelope yet, the one from the Canadian Forces Records Office in Ottawa. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. But the truth, the real truth she didn't say out loud even to herself, was that she was afraid of what it would confirm. Hazel was 31 years old. She'd spent 4 years as a combat medic with the Canadian Armed Forces, 2 of them deployed, 1 tour in Mali and 1 in Latvia, and then another 3 as a registered nurse in the cardiac care unit at Sunridge General in Burlington, Ontario. She had a small apartment on Plains Road with a window that faced the escarpment. She had a cat named Brigadier who ate too much and judged her constantly. She had a row of commendation certificates on the wall above her desk and a wooden box on the closet shelf that she hadn't opened since she moved in. What she did not have, as of 11 days ago, was a job. The official reason given was conduct inconsistent with patient safety protocols. The unofficial reason, the one she'd pieced together from 2 terse conversations with HR and 1 very awkward hallway exchange with her unit supervisor, Dr. Kellard, was that she had reported a medication discrepancy that turned out to implicate the hospital's most senior cardiologist, a man named Overton. She'd flagged the issue through proper channels, filled out the forms, followed the process exactly as she'd been trained to do in the military, and then in nursing school, and then during her 3 years on the ward. And then, somehow, she was the one who no longer worked there. She understood intellectually that this was wrong. She understood it the way you understand that a weather system is technically a collection of pressure differentials. You know the science, but it doesn't make the storm feel any less enormous when it's sitting on top of your house. The money was going to run out in 6 weeks. That was the number she'd worked out on the back of a Loblaws receipt while sitting in her car outside the Fortinos on Guelph Line. 6 weeks before she'd be unable to cover rent. She had no family in Burlington. Her mother was in Charlottetown, her father somewhere in Alberta she hadn't spoken to in years. She had friends, good ones, but the kind of pride that gets trained into you when you spend years in uniform made it almost impossible to say the words "I need help" out loud. So she did what she could. She sold her road bike on Facebook Marketplace. She returned a winter jacket she'd bought in October and hadn't worn yet. She canceled her gym membership and her streaming subscriptions and the monthly donation she'd been making to the food bank since she got her first nursing paycheck. And that cancellation, small as it was, made her feel a particular kind of shame she hadn't expected. And then she thought about the box on the closet shelf. The shop was called Lakeside Exchange. It was on Brant Street, tucked between a bubble tea place and a used bookstore, the kind of shop with a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising cash paid for gold, electronics, musical instruments, military collectibles. Hazel had driven past it a dozen times without ever thinking about stopping. She stopped now. She sat in her car for a while first. The wooden box was on the passenger seat. It was about the size of a shoebox, pine with a brass clasp, the kind of thing you could buy at any craft store. Inside it were 7 items: a service medal from the Mali deployment, a NATO medal, a meritorious service commendation that she'd received in her final year, a unit citation, 2 regimental pins, and one thing she never talked about, a star of military valor that had been awarded quietly and quickly and without much ceremony near the end of her second tour, for something that had happened on a Thursday afternoon that she still sometimes dreamed about. The SMV was Canada's second highest military decoration. She was aware that it was worth something to collectors. She did not let herself think about what it meant to her, because that line of thinking did not lead anywhere useful right now. She picked up the box and went inside. The man behind the counter was named Gord. He was in his late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a blue flannel shirt, and he looked up from a display case he was organizing when she came in. "Help you with something? I have some military medals," Hazel said. "I was told you buy those." Gord nodded slowly. "I do, yeah. Let's have a look." She set the box on the glass counter and opened the clasp. Gord leaned forward and put his reading glasses on. He was quiet for a moment, which Hazel appreciated. Some people, when they saw this kind of thing, launched into a speech about service and sacrifice, and she didn't think she could take that right now without her composure cracking in an embarrassing way. He picked up the service medal first, turned it over, set it down. Then the NATO medal, then the commendation. Then he picked up the Star of Military Valor. He was quiet for longer this time. "This yours?" he asked. "Yes." He looked at her over the tops of his glasses. "You know what this is." It wasn't a question, she answered it anyway. "Yes." Gord set it back in the box very carefully. He took his glasses off, folded them, and set them on the counter. He seemed to be working through something internally. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm not trying to be intrusive," he said. "Are you okay?" Hazel had been holding herself together with the particular rigidity of someone who has decided that holding themselves together is the only option. The question, asked with such plain and genuine concern, almost undid her. "I'm managing," she said. "You don't have to sell these. I know that. I mean," he paused, "I can make you an offer. The SMV especially, there are collectors who'd pay significant money. But I want you to know that you don't have to." "I appreciate that," Hazel said. "I'd like to know what they're worth." Gord nodded. He had just started reaching for his phone, probably to look something up, when the bell above the shop door rang. She heard the dog before she saw it, the soft, dense sound of large paws on hardwood, and then she felt it, a weight settling against her left leg, warm and solid, the way a sandbag settles. She looked down. It was a Belgian Malinois, working harness, tan and black, with the kind of stillness in the eyes that you only ever see in animals that have been trained to operate in high-stakes environments. It had pressed its head against her thigh and was not moving. "Sable." A man's voice, firm but not alarmed. "Sable, come." The dog did not come. Hazel turned. The man standing just inside the doorway was tall, maybe 40, wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray Henley, but with the posture of someone who'd spent years in uniform. It was the kind of thing you noticed if you'd been the same way yourself. His name, she'd later find out, was Callum Weeb. He'd served 12 years with the Joint Task Force 2 before a knee injury ended his operational career. He was in Burlington visiting his sister, and he had stopped at Lakeside Exchange because he'd sold Gord a guitar 6 months ago and wanted to see if he had any decent acoustics in stock. He had not expected his dog to refuse a direct command. Sable had both front paws on the counter now, nose moving over the wooden box, over the metals inside it, with an intensity that was almost uncanny. "I'm sorry," Weeb said, crossing the shop quickly. "She doesn't usually." "Sable, come." The Malinois turned her head and looked at him with an expression that, if you were being unscientific about it, could only be described as no. Then she turned back and rested her chin on Hazel's arm. Hazel stood very still. She had spent a lot of time around working dogs during her military service, and she understood that what was happening was not nothing. She didn't know what Sable was reacting to. The scent of the metals, some subtle cue in Hazel's body language, something else entirely, but she'd learned a long time ago to pay attention when an animal with good training decided that something mattered. Weeby was looking at the box on the counter, then at Hazel, then at the box again. "Are those yours?" he asked. She'd been asked that twice now in 4 minutes. "Yes." He didn't say anything right away. He reached out and touched the edge of the box, not opening it, just touching it the way you touch something you recognize. "SMV?" he asked quietly. She nodded. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She would have stepped back from pity. It was closer to recognition. "My name's Callum," he said. "Hazel, Hazel," he repeated. "Can I ask what branch?" "Canadian Army. Combat medic. 2 tours." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's going on?" And for reasons she still can't fully explain, the dog's weight still against her arm, the plain directness of the question, the accumulated exhaustion of 11 days of silence, she told him. She didn't tell him everything. She told him enough. The hospital, the medication discrepancy she'd reported, the cardiologist named Overton, the termination, the 6 weeks of money she had left. The box on the passenger seat of her car that she'd been building up to opening for 3 years. Callum listened the way people listen when they've been trained to gather information quickly and completely, without interrupting, without filling silences, without making the small, reassuring sounds that most people make to signal that they're paying attention. He just listened. When she finished, he said, "Have you talked to anyone at the hospital, in writing?" "HR, twice, a lawyer. I can't afford a lawyer." He nodded slowly. "There's a clinic at McMaster that does pro bono employment cases. I know someone there." She looked at him. "Why would you? You don't know me." He glanced down at Sable, who was still pressed against Hazel's side with the commitment of a dog who had decided something and was not interested in reconsidering. "She knows you," he said. "That's usually enough for me." Gord, behind the counter, had been quiet for several minutes. He cleared his throat now. "I'm going to say something, and I hope you'll both take it in the spirit it's intended," he said. He was looking at Hazel. "I've been in this business for 22 years. I've bought medals from estates, from collectors, from people who needed money. I've never once felt good about it." He paused. "I'm not going to make you an offer today, not because I don't think they're valuable, because I don't think selling them is going to solve the actual problem." Hazel opened her mouth. "I know," he said, before she could speak. "You need money. That's real. But what you described to me, wrongful termination, after you did the right thing, that's a different problem. And it has a different solution." She stood there for a moment between the two men and the dog that would not leave her side, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 11 days. Not hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile, too far away. Something more like the first small loosening of a knot she'd stopped believing could come undone. The lawyer's name was Renata Cho. She was 38, a partner at the McMaster-affiliated legal clinic, and she had the particular quality of focused energy that Hazel associated with people who worked too hard on principle rather than for money. She met with Hazel on a Thursday afternoon in an office that smelled like coffee and printer paper, listened to the whole story without notes, and then said, "Tell me exactly what you documented." Hazel had documented everything. This was the thing that nobody at Sunridge General seemed to have accounted for. She was a combat medic. She had spent years operating in environments where incomplete documentation could get people killed. She didn't know how to be careless with records. Every conversation, every form she'd submitted, every email she'd sent, she'd kept copies. She had timestamps. She had the original medication discrepancy report with the file number and the date and the name of the charge nurse she'd handed it to. Renata read through it all and then looked up. "Okay," she said. "This is good. This is actually very good. Is it enough? It's a strong case for wrongful dismissal. Overton's name is going to make this complicated, but..." She paused, seeming to choose her words. "Do you know who Overton is? Outside of the hospital?" Hazel didn't. She'd looked him up after the termination but hadn't found much beyond his hospital profile. Renata told her. Overton had been the subject of a college complaint 2 years earlier, unrelated to Sunridge General, that had been quietly resolved. His father-in-law was on the hospital's board of directors. He had operated at Sunridge for 11 years, and his billing numbers were among the highest in the cardiac unit. The picture that emerged was not surprising. It was just very, very clear. "He's been protected," Hazel said. "Until now, apparently," Renata said, "because you documented everything. The weeks that followed were not simple." Hazel would not want anyone to think they were simple. She was still not working. She borrowed money from a friend, finally, painfully asking out loud to cover November's rent. She ate a lot of rice and lentils and did not find this particularly romantic or character-building, the way people sometimes retroactively describe hard times. It was just hard. But things were also, quietly, beginning to move. Renata filed a complaint with the Ontario Labour Relations Board and initiated a wrongful dismissal claim. The clinic also connected Hazel with a veterans advocacy organization that took one look at her service record and her termination circumstances and assigned her a caseworker named Brenda who called every Tuesday to check in and who did not accept "I'm fine" as an answer. Callum Wiebe, for his part, did not disappear after the afternoon at Lakeside Exchange. He was in Burlington for another week visiting his sister, and he called Hazel twice during that time, once to pass along Renata's contact information, once to tell her that a colleague of his, a woman who'd also served with JTF2 and now ran a healthcare workers advocacy network out of Toronto, wanted to connect with her. "You don't have to," he said, "but she's worth talking to." Hazel talked to her, and Sable, the Malinois who had refused to come when called that afternoon in the pawn shop, who had pressed her solid, warm weight against the arm of a woman who hadn't let herself cry in 11 days. Sable had apparently done this kind of thing before. Callum mentioned it almost in passing 2 weeks later. That Sable sometimes reacted to people in ways that he'd learned not to question. Something about scent, or posture, or some combination of signals that a dog trained in human pattern recognition could detect and a human couldn't. "She knew you were a medic," he said. Hazel wasn't sure she believed that. She wasn't sure she didn't believe it either. The complaint hearing was held in December in a beige government building in Hamilton that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet. Hazel sat at a table with Renata on one side and a binder of documentation on the other. Across the table, Sunridge General was represented by 2 lawyers in expensive suits who smiled at each other a lot and at Hazel not at all. Overton was not there. His absence was conspicuous. What was there? Hazel's medication discrepancy report. The timestamp showing it had been submitted 18 days before her termination. The email chain in which her unit supervisor, Dr. Kellard, had asked her in writing to consider the broader impact of escalating this matter. Her written response, which she'd kept, in which she'd said that she understood the concern but felt obligated to follow patient safety protocols as she'd been trained to do. Renata was methodical and very calm. She did not raise her voice. She didn't have to. By mid-January, Sunridge General had settled. The terms were confidential, but they included reinstatement of employment, back pay covering the entire period of termination, and a formal written acknowledgement, not quite an apology, but close enough, that Hazel's conduct had been consistent with professional nursing standards and patient safety obligations. Overton resigned from the hospital in February. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario opened a new file. Hazel did not follow what happened next very closely. She had learned, over years of operating in environments where justice was slow and imperfect, that you couldn't afford to make any single outcome the measure of whether the effort had been worth it. The effort was worth it because she'd done the right thing. That was the measure. That was the only one that held up under pressure. On a Saturday in March, Hazel drove back to Brant Street. The bubble tea place was busy, steam fogging its windows. Lakeside Exchange was open. Gord was behind the counter, with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, exactly as she'd found him in October. She set the wooden box on the counter. "I'm not here to sell anything," she said. He smiled. "I didn't think you were." She opened the clasp. The medals were all there, exactly as she'd left them. The service medal, the NATO medal, the commendation, the citation, the pins, and the Star of Military Valor in its fitted slot in the center of the box. She looked at them for a moment. She had spent a long time feeling like the things she'd done to earn these were separate from the person she'd become afterward, that the military version of her and the nursing version of her were 2 different women who happened to share a body. But standing in a small shop on Brant Street in Burlington in March, she thought maybe that had never actually been true. Maybe the woman who had spent a Thursday afternoon in Mali making fast, clear decisions under terrible pressure was exactly the same woman who had filed a medication discrepancy report and then kept copies of everything and then refused to back down. Same training, same instinct, same stubborn, fundamental belief that the people in your care are worth fighting for even when fighting costs you something. She closed the box. "I wanted you to see them properly," she told Gord, "not as something I was selling, just as what they are." He nodded. He understood. Outside, March was doing what March in Ontario does, cold and gray with an uncertain quality of light that could go either way, toward more winter or toward something else. Hazel stood on the sidewalk for a moment, box under her arm, and let herself feel the full weight of the last several months. Not the heaviness of it, but the actual weight, the dense, real physical fact of having carried something difficult and not put it down. She'd start back at Sunridge the following Monday. The cardiac care unit, 3rd floor, day shift. She had already told Brenda, her caseworker, who had said something characteristic and warm, and had then immediately asked about 3 other things on the agenda, because that was how Brenda operated, and Hazel had come to find it genuinely comforting. She had called her mother in Charlottetown and talked for an hour, longer than they'd talked in years. Her mother had cried a little and then made a joke about it, the way she always did. She had texted Callum, who was back in Ottawa by then, and he'd responded with a photograph of Sable on a hiking trail in Gatineau Park, ears up, looking directly at the camera with the expression of a dog who had long ago decided that she understood something about the world that most people were still working out. Hazel had saved the photograph. She walked back to her car. She set the box on the passenger seat, where it had sat in October, and she drove home along the lakeshore route, longer, not faster, but on a gray March morning, with the water flat and silver off to her left, it was the right way to go. The box stayed on the shelf where it belonged. The cat, Brigadier, knocked something off the counter the moment she walked in, watched it fall, and then looked at her with complete indifference. She fed him. She made tea. She stood at the window that faced the escarpment and watched the clouds move over the ridge. The same clouds, the same ridge, but somehow the view had shifted in some way she couldn't quite articulate and didn't particularly need to. She was 31 years old. She had her job back. She had the medals, she had done the things she was trained to do, and it had cost her, and she had held on anyway. That, in the end, was the only story worth telling.